You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Biden opens Africa Summit with sanctioning African leaders. The Biden administration is holding a summit with some 40 leaders of African countries. The New York Times headline of its reporting on the summit is incredibly revealing. Biden is bringing Africa's leaders to Washington, hoping to impress. That headline speaks volumes, in my opinion, about the colonized versus the colonizer relationship. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So the administration is bringing leaders to Washington. I think they could have even used the term summoned leaders to Washington. Why not invited them to Washington? Moon of Alabama asked the question, isn't this reminiscent to the millions of Africans who had been brought to America in past centuries? Your thoughts, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, this is neocolonialism 2.0. It's neocolonialism for the 21st century. Now, supposedly, the United States did not summon, to use that verb, leaders of Guinea, Conakry, Mali, Burkina Faso because of their being suspended from the African Union because of the allegations concerning internal democracy and military coups. But my question is, why was not the leader of Zimbabwe given an invitation to come to Washington? He's in good books with the African Union. Obviously, we know the reason, which is that some years ago, the ruling party sought to address settler colonialism by redistributing land from the European invaders who only arrived in the late 19th century to various Africans. That led to a round of sanctions imposed by the United States, Britain, Australia, pressure on South Africa and its neighbors to follow up with sanctions. Fortunately, South Africa, under the African National Congress government, was sufficiently wise to balk at that measure. But it's also fair to say that that balking did not improve the relations between then South African leader Thabo Mbeki and Washington, which ultimately led to his being dislodged, which then led to Jacob Zuma taking his place, who inaugurated a reign of corruption. And now he's been replaced by Cyril Ramaphosa, who almost got impeached because tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of dollars were found at his commodious estate without going through Pretoria's banking regulations. So Washington has a lot of explaining to do with regard to this African summit. It's clearly an effort to pivot the post China and Russia, and not to mention Turkey and India, and not to mention the fact that South Africa, the giant of the Southern Cone, has ambitions all of its own with regard to regional economies. Washington may not be in accord with South Africa's ambitions, and the same holds true for the giant of the continent, speaking of Nigeria, and its ambitions for the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. So I don't think that this summit, despite the sums now being tossed around in the press that supposedly are going to Africa for green energy and all the rest, I'm not sure if this is all going to pan out.
When you mentioned the decision to redistribute land to Africans, in Zimbabwe, I think it's very important for people to understand that that wasn't just some arbitrary decision that was made, that it was an agreement between Robert Mugabe representing Zimbabwe, I think Margaret Thatcher as the Prime Minister of Britain, and Jimmy Carter as President of the United States. They reached a formal agreement called the Lancaster House Agreement that said Britain would pay the British settlers for the land that was going to be repatriated to the Zimbabweans, and that the United States co-signed that agreement saying if Britain didn't pay, the United States would pay. And Britain and the United States reneged on that agreement. And Robert Mugabe told the Zimbabweans, look, don't call me, call Britain, because I'm doing what I signed to do. Dr. Horne.
Well, that's a fair assessment. In fact, listeners interested in following up can look at my book, Dealing with U.S. Zimbabwean Relations, that came out some years ago. And it's no secret to suggest that part of the discontent in Southern Africa with Washington has to do with this attempt to punish Zimbabwe. And it's not only an attempt to punish Zimbabwe, it's an attempt to send a message to neighboring Namibia, which in size is as big as Texas and California combined, although it only has a population somewhat less than 3 million compared to Texas and California, 60 million plus. And the German and Afrikaner settlers in Namibia were quite happy that Zimbabwe was punished, as they thought that this would mean that they would hold on to their land. So it seems to me that if Washington is really honest and sincere about having positive relations with Africa, they could move away from its 19th century policy of gunboat diplomacy and allow self-determination and sovereignty to be exercised, for example, by the government of Zimbabwe.
People's Dispatch, Kerekwe Opoku, had an opening address at the West African People for a New World Conference in Ghana. He discussed the necessity of building working class unity in the region, and the People's Dispatch actually has an excerpt from his address that's very interesting. Your thoughts on that, Dr. Horne?
Well, certainly let us hope that the sentiments expressed in that People's Dispatch article have captured mass sentiment in Ghana, which, by the way, is under the gun from the international vultures, speaking of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and also over the centuries has suffered grievously, not only because of the unlimited African slave trade, but post-1957, recall under Kwame Nkrumah, the founding father, he too came into conflict with Washington because he opened his door to African-American exiles, including W.E.B. Du Bois, who moved there in 1961 at the age of 93. He was followed by scores of other African-American exiles as well. This did not go down very well in Washington because they thought that Ghana would become some sort of rear base for subversion against the United States of America, and that particular perception was not squashed when the man then known as Malcolm X came in to Ghana before he was assassinated in February 1965. Of course, this led in 1966 to a CIA-sponsored coup against Ghana, which set back development for decades. And so let us hope that this People's Dispatch article that you cite and the keynote address that you reference is capturing the progressive and militant sentiments that Ghana so desperately needs and deserves today.
And part of this address, Opoku says, we meet here because we know, despite the misery and chaos of our current circumstances, that it is possible to build a prosperous, just, progressive, sustainable, and humane society, a new world free from poverty, disease, homelessness, hunger, ignorance, and war. We meet here because we not only know this, but because we are committed to it. We meet here because we know that to achieve that vision, as Nkrumah taught us, we must unite our continent. I wonder if the leaders that have come to Washington, most of whom will probably not see Joe Biden, because from what I understand, it's really going to be American underlings that are meeting with these leaders. It's not as though for the next couple of days, Joe Biden is in face-to-face meetings with these individuals, that they would articulate this perspective and understand that their poverty, disease, homelessness, hunger, ignorance, and war has a lot to do with American neocolonialism, American colonialism, and intervention in their countries, as opposed to, as Joe Biden loves to talk about, the United States supporting democracy and the United States respecting sovereignty and the will of the people should be heard, quoting Joe Biden. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, I noticed the pictures involving Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of the Military Lloyd Austin meeting with a number of African leaders. It seems to me that was a violation of protocol. It seems to me that heads of state and government should be meeting with their peers here in Washington, not with the underlings, to use their term. And in any case, I was quite struck by the fact that the leader of Somalia was face-to-face with Anthony Blinken, because those of us familiar with the history of that country in the Horn of Africa know that it basically reached a state of declension and was moving downward on a socioeconomic level after they were encouraged. The government in Mogadishu was encouraged to attack neighboring Ethiopia because of this divide and rule strategy, because of Cold War pressure, because Ethiopia then was considered to be close to the Soviet Union and the United States did not approve. And so the United States, it seems to me that much of the time at this so-called summit could be better spent by Secretary of State Blinken issuing lengthy apologies to Somalia and other African nations, apologizing for the decades, if not centuries, of wrong-headed policies of Washington and U.S. colonialism and U.S. settler colonialism and neo-imperialism. That, it seems to me, is the first step on the path not only towards justice, but ultimately towards reparations. Reparations to those who have been treated so shamelessly and shamefully by U.S. imperialism.
Popularresistance.org, Biden is bringing Africa's leaders to Washington, hoping to impress them. When they have a quote from President Macky Sall of Senegal: "Let no one tell us no, don't work with so-and-so, just work with us. We want to work and trade with everyone." It seems to me that that focus also is on the recent legislation that was passed, the countering malign Russian influence in Africa, that they're well aware of that and pushing back on that. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, certainly what Macky Sall, the leader of Senegal and a principal leader of the African Union, says is meritorious. But obviously, that meritorious point conflicts and contrasts with the point being enunciated by Washington, which is looking to ignite a new Cold War, not only with China, but with Russia, and for any other nation that is sufficiently audacious to cross U.S. imperialism. However, I trust and I hope that the African leaders are aware of these devilish plans and therefore will respond accordingly.
And to that point, this whole thing about the United States trying to impress these leaders, I'm wondering what it is that the United States is trying to impress upon them as they interact with China, who is engaged in business, who is restructuring debt, as they engage with Russia, who is providing them with fertilizer, providing them with wheat, restructuring debt. I'm trying to figure out what it is that the United States is trying to impress upon them as the United States, through the World Bank, through the IMF, has them in debt peonage and wants to limit their abilities to do business and develop their economies.
Well, what's curious about this present moment is that during the Cold War, the United States helped to whip up what is now called religious fundamentalism or Islamic fundamentalism, which is now, of course, running rampant throughout the Sahel region of Africa, not only the nations we made reference to earlier, such as Mali and Burkina Faso, but also Niger and Chad as well. And so Washington creates this problem, and now supposedly it's trying to solve this problem. But of course, we know that the bottom line is that these hard-pressed governments will be encouraged and enticed to spend taxpayers' dollars on U.S. weapons to fight this insurgency that Washington helped to create in the first place. It's a racket, and I'm sure the African leaders are intelligent enough to sense that that is the case.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. We greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.